they've taken to other teachers other than Paul, who are leading them away from the one truth, the gospel of Jesus, that Paul had taught them. And so Paul was forced into boasting because that's what these false apostles have been doing. And so he feels like he has to do the same thing to draw his children back again. He's boasted of his sufferings, his beatings, his imprisonments, his shipwrecks and all those sort of things. And now he's going to boast of a vision. Now, one of the confusing things about this reading is that Paul talks as if he says, I know a man who so many years ago, 14 years ago, had this vision. But every commentator you will ever read, including the greats like Calvin and Augustine and all that, they all say that Paul here is talking about himself. He's using the third person to talk about it because he doesn't want to boast. And so he's saying, he's saying, oh, I know a man, but that man is him. And we can be pretty sure of that because in verse 7 there he says, to keep me from being too elated by the surpassing greatness of the revelations. So, he sort of gives it away there. So this is a vision that Paul himself had. He's gone 14 years and he hasn't told anyone publicly about this vision. That's how much he hasn't boasted about it. This is not the vision he had at his conversion, the one on the road to Damascus. For a start, the timing was all wrong, and anyway, he had no problem telling people about that. There's twice in the book of Acts where he's arrested in the temple at Jerusalem, and he relates the experience of his conversion to all these people. And then later in Acts chapter 26, in front of King Agrippa, he tells the same story again of the shining light and being knocked to the ground on the road to Damascus. So it's not that vision that we're talking about here. It's something else. And he doesn't understand it. He doesn't really, even though it was an amazing experience for him, he doesn't really understand it himself. Twice he says, I don't know. Was it in my body that I saw these things, or was it a spiritual experience separate from his body? He doesn't know. There's several other times when Paul spoke of visions, but generally these are what you might call instructive visions, where Jesus is telling him to do something, like the man from Macedonia who was calling him to come over there, or the angel that stood with him on the ship when it was about to be wrecked and said that nobody on the ship would die, they will all survive. But none of these visions fits the description that Paul gives here. This is something else that clearly he's never spoken of before. Why? Well, clearly just because he doesn't like to boast. But much against his will, he's being forced to do so by these false apostles who are not at all reluctant to boast about experiences that they've claimed to have had. It's a real temptation in the church, isn't it, to try to give yourself some authority, especially if you're having a disagreement and you're sort of on the losing side, some point of doctrine or what the church should do, and it's going badly for you, and you're losing the argument. You need to bring out the big guns, and you say, well, the Lord spoke to me and gave me this vision, and that's what these false apostles have been doing, telling stories of mystical experiences to give themselves credibility in the church. And apparently that tactic was working. The Corinthians were inclined to listen to these shysters, and instead of the gospel that Paul had told them. Poor old Paul, the church that he founded, and you can tell that he just loves them dearly, is behaving like an unfaithful wife and running off after other lovers whose motives were suspect, to say the least. And so he's resorting to these desperate measures of boasting, although his rule in life is to be humble and exalt only Christ. He now finds himself, though, having to boast. In chapter 11, the previous chapter, he'd had to boast. He had boasted of his sufferings, If we just read back the sufferings and also his heritage as an Israelite, he says, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? Well, I'm a better one. And I'm talking like a madman, with far greater labours, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city and danger in the wilderness, danger at sea and danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from the other things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. So his qualifications to be a church leader from sufferings, which he regarded as more important than visions, he's very well qualified. But now though, because the others are boasting of visions, he's going to too. He knows it's a foolish thing to do. God doesn't give visions or those sort of experiences so we can boast about it. They have a purpose, but it isn't to exalt ourselves. And Paul knows that too, but he must do it for the good of the church. And yet he restrains himself. There's things about this vision that he's not going to tell us. He said he heard things which cannot be told, which man may not utter. He knows this vision, the vision of paradise, was given for his benefit, but not to elevate him above Christ. Look, this is just conjecture, but I would assume that it was given to strengthen him for the sufferings that were coming in his life, that lay ahead. Now, I mean, imagine if you were lifted into heaven and you could see what was waiting for you when you die. Wouldn't any trouble that you suffered in this life seem very trivial? And so Paul says it in Romans 8, he would have written this after he'd had this vision. He said, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. And earlier on in 2 Corinthians, in chapter 4, he refers to his troubles as light and momentary troubles that are preparing us for an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So these things are promises of one who has been given the privilege of seeing into heaven. And that makes sense of Paul's almost complete disregard for his own well-being, for his own safety. He was always doing Jesus' work, and hang the consequences. Consequences, schmonsequences, as long as I'm doing the Lord's work. In verse 2, the third heaven. It's probably a Jewish expression where the skies were referred to as the heavens, and then the stars and planets would be above that, the second heavens, and God is above the heavens. He would be in the third heaven, that's the proper heaven, or the one we think of heaven, I suppose, as spiritual heaven. But this is conjecture. We don't know for certain. I mean, Deuteronomy chapter 10 says, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens. So, there's a lot of sort of overlapping phrases that we use to describe not only the skies and the planets, but the heavens above. And Ephesians 4 tells us that Christ ascended far above all the heavens that he might fill all things. Well, after such an amazing revelation then, it was a blessing given to Paul, and how many others? Maybe none. He might start to think, God loves me so much, he's given me this amazing vision. He must love me so much that my life from here on will be sweet. Nothing will trouble me. God won't let any trouble befall me. Otherwise, he wouldn't have given me this vision. Wrong. And so we come to Paul's thorn in the flesh. a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being too elevated. Well, what is it? What is the thorn in the flesh? This is a question that's troubled Bible scholars for 2,000 years. I mean, the options that I've heard, and wouldn't be an exhaustive list, it was some sort of chronic disease is probably the most obvious one. Maybe epilepsy, maybe malaria. Malaria, a lot of the places that Paul visited was known that malaria was endemic there. And it's a disease that can keep coming back. It might have been deafness or poor vision, both of which would have been a big problem for a man like Paul, the world's greatest evangelist that's ever been. It could have been some sort of skin condition that kept bursting out on him, and it's not. We tend to think that it's not a good look for an evangelist to look ill. Why hasn't God healed him? That tends to be the way I think. I remember a couple of times where I've had to front up to preach and I've been really crook. And I thought, this is not a good look. But isn't it? Is it? That's what we think, but is it? I remember hearing about John Stott did a mission in Sydney back in the 1960s, the great evangelical preacher. And it was at Sydney University. And I remember hearing Philip Jensen talk about it, and that would have been in about the year 2000. And that it went really well, this mission that went for a week. But on the last night at which John Stott was to speak, and that was the really big night where they rented this large hall and they expected it to be filled, but he came down with the flu. And he was really, really ill, so much that he could hardly speak. And when he spoke, it was just a sort of a croak, He was crook. And to make it worse, his father back in England had died the day before. Everybody thought, well, you probably should go home and we'll find someone else. But he said, no, I've said I'll do it, and I'll do it. And so the hall was packed for this night, and John Stott was speaking into a microphone, of course, but so quietly that there was just a deathly hush over the whole building. Everyone strained to hear every word he said. And from that one meeting, Philip Jensen said that if you looked around Sydney in the year 2000, so many of the pastors and leaders of the evangelical church, the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, all around Sydney, so many of their leaders and pastors had been at that meeting and had decided to go into ministry because of what they heard that night. Well, another suggestion for the thorn has been that the thorn is a person. This tends to be popular with people who believe that Christians should never be sick. That if we're not healed, then that's just a lack of faith on our part. So then if the thorn is a bit of a problem for them if it's an illness, because, Paul is obviously qualifies as a Christian, so how come he's crook? Well, that theory is that, it's a person that is one of the false apostles perhaps, but it doesn't really make sense, because if that was the case, he could just up and leave or, go somewhere else. And another proposal that was big in the Middle Ages, apparently, is that the thorn was some sin in Paul's life that he's struggling to control. In support of that theory is Romans 7, where Paul wrote, "For I do not do the good that I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing." Some people object to that idea because they say, well, yeah, but Paul there was talking about before he was converted. But when you read chapter 7 of Romans, it's not the way it reads. It just doesn't seem that way at all. And I think the people who object to it are doing so because of their very high regard for Paul, and they don't want to see him defamed, especially since he can't answer for himself. But I also love Paul, and I love his writings. He's left the church a priceless gift. If Jesus hadn't singled Paul out for a lifetime of ministry, it's hard to see how the church would have ever survived, at least after the first few centuries, because virtually every name who was big in, say, the Reformation, Huss and Luther and Calvin, and in the Great Awakening that followed it with Whitfield and Wesley and Edwards. All of these people, when you read their biographies, Paul's writings that figure very heavily in their conversion, especially the letter to the Romans. They all trace their own awakenings back to there. But all of this doesn't mean that Paul was a sinless being. Rather, he was very aware that he depended every day on the mercy of God through Jesus. But then John Calvin said that the whole idea that Paul's thorn was a sin was just ridiculous. So, Anyway, it's good, in a way, that we don't know what it is. I mean, imagine, say, if his thorn in the flesh was epilepsy, say. He was an epileptic, and every now and again he would go into a fit, which would obviously be very distressing for everyone. Well, then, when we read this, if you were an epileptic, you would strongly identify with it. But everyone else would just sort of skip over it and say, oh, that doesn't really apply to me. But since we don't know what it is, this can apply to virtually anything. But anyway, he wants this thorn to be gone, and he prays. It's causing him trouble, and he wants it gone. So he cries out to the Lord, "Please take this away." And he does this 3 times, not in some sort of casual passing fashion. Just a little bit added on to the end of his daily prayers. But he pleaded with the Lord that it might leave me, verse 8, 3 times. But God, who always works for our good, says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Look, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, dear people, but this is actually true. His power is made perfect in our weakness. The man whose confidence lies in his health or his wealth or his prosperity or the strength of the name of his family or whatever, God has no use for him. Isaiah 66, "This is the one I esteem, he who is humble and contrite in spirit and trembles at my word." There's a quote from Spurgeon that I know I've used it lots of times before, so you'll just have to humour me because I'm going to use it again, where he talked about trials. And he said, in seasons of severe trial, the Christian has nothing on earth that he can trust to, and is therefore compelled to cast himself on his God alone. When his vessel is on its beam ends and no human deliverance is available, he must simply and entirely trust himself to the providence and care of God. Oh, happy storm that wrecks a man on a rock such as this. Oh, blessed hurricane that drives the soul to God and God alone. Look, I thank God for modern medicine, without which I would almost certainly be dead. And there's new treatments are being discovered all the time. But there's still going to come a day when a doctor says to you, "Look, there's nothing more we can do for you." And none of us likes pain or disability, but Christians should look at it differently to other people. I mean, here we have Paul with something he doesn't want. He asks God to take it away, but God declines, and Paul accepts the decision. He mightn't have liked it, but it was for his good and God's glory. And for Paul, that was a completely good and sufficient reason. And so instead of wallowing in self-pity, he says, "I'll boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may rest on me." Verse 9. Look, I'm sure this took a lot of God's grace, as well as Paul's effort and practice. He wrote in Philippians, "I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound." Well, to summarise then, we'd perhaps expect in a chapter that's got two main points in it, an amazing vision and a common ordinary illness or whatever it was, that Paul would write at length about what he saw in heaven and hardly even mention his affliction. But no, it's the other way around. He's almost embarrassed by the incredible things he saw in heaven, and he won't even mention them. In contrast, he gives us powerful teaching on God's grace and good purposes in trials. Trials will come, we all know that, and we must prepare for them. How? Well, it's the old fall back to basics. Read the Bible. Read Job. Read the Psalms and Jeremiah and Luke and Acts and Romans and 2 Corinthians and Philippians and 1 and 2 Timothy. They're the ones that really major heavily on suffering. And then read the rest. And pray. Ask God not to spare us from trials, but that in the evil day we will stand firm. When our plans for this life collapse around us, pray that we will face them and overcome them, not because I am tough, but because His grace is sufficient for me. Is there any sin that gets more airtime in the Bible than pride? I don't think there is. I mean, Paul had more reason than anyone to be proud, but God will not allow it. The glory belongs to Him alone. And if His beloved people fall into pride, God will go to great lengths to make us humble, as He did with Paul. So he wrote, "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for His good pleasure. And expect trials in this life, for His grace is sufficient for you." Amen.